Hello, high school students. We would like to welcome you to the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum's webinar for our Race Ed and Conscious Curriculum and Conversations project for high school students. My name is Heather Williams, and I'm the Program Director at SACAM. During this webinar, we ask that you please type any questions you may have about today's discussion in the Q&A area of the Zoom call, and your question will be presented to the panelists as soon as we can. The Conscious Conversations webinar is the brainchild of two high school students who currently attend Lady Bird Johnson High School right here in San Antonio, Texas. These bright students saw a need to educate fellow students of all levels to assist them in coping with the social and racial impacts of what they observed because of racism and prejudices. They reached out to us at the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum for guidance and support. We were thrilled to help them in their endeavor. After careful thought, consideration, research, and community feedback, the project began to take shape, and the Race Ed Conscious Curriculum and Conversations was born, brought to you by SACAM and Google Fiber. We are so happy that you chose to join us for tonight's topic, Diasporic Education. So without further ado, I am proud to present to you our Race Ed hosts, Avery Neal and Abived Pulapaka. We welcome you both, Avery and Abived. Why don't you introduce our distinguished experts tonight?
Sure. So today we have Dr. Sunita Punjabi. She's the founder of the Brain Science Symposium for the city of San Antonio. Dr. Punjabi is also known as the Brain Coach, currently practicing in the medical center where she's doing research and is assisting people to create a cause-driven life. Dr. Sunita uses neurointegration technology and psychology to help individuals experience mental transformations that can be measured at the neurological level. Thank you, Dr. Punjabi, for being here.
We also have Dr. Charles Gentry with us tonight, who is a versatile educator and consultant for local artists, community organizations, and small businesses. He has taught high school and college level arts, culture, and computer application courses, and was a curator and theater manager at the Flint Institute of Arts in Michigan. A San Antonio native, Charles also enjoys being actively involved as a certified tourism ambassador, World Heritage Ambassador, high school lacrosse coach, and community volunteer. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Dr. Gentry. And if we could now have a topic introduction, that would be great.
Thank you, Avery and Abi, for your leadership in developing this series. And it's a pleasure to join you all again for another installment in the Race Ed Conscious Conversations, Conscious Curriculum series. And for our guest, you will see that a poll has appeared on your screen at this time, and we're asking you to answer a couple of polls as we go through tonight's session. This is the first of three that we'll ask you to participate in during the session, and this one asks, which of the following holidays does your family celebrate? You can select more than one if you celebrate more than one, or if your family celebrates none of these listed, but perhaps something else, then there's an option there. Or if your family does not celebrate holidays, then there's also an option for that. So please go ahead and participate and answer as many as are relevant for you. And I'll go ahead and share my screen to introduce the topic for today. And we're discussing diasporic heritage and traditions. And in order to get into that conversation, we're going to first define our terms. And I wanted not only to refer to the term diaspora, but also to some of the other related key terms that we introduced on the SACAM website. So if you had a chance to go to sacam.org/race-ed, then you'll see our curriculum guides as well as some online activities and resources that we've provided for this session. And so without further ado, I'll just move forward in the presentation to look at some of the related key terms. We'll define diaspora in just a moment, but some of the other key terms that we'll be discussing today include birthplace and migration, And of course, the birthplace is the ground on which a group adopted a common social title and classification. We'll talk about immigration and emigration, and to immigrate with an IM means to come into a nation or settlement. To emigrate or outmigrate means to leave one's nation or settlement, perhaps to seek asylum elsewhere. And then we have homeland and identity. And here we're referring to a cultural identity as how you and or others who share characteristics to you are identify yourself. So it could be a common language or an ancestral homeland. And then finally, a term that is becoming more and more important in the modern age is this idea of exile. And so this can be a prolonged separation from a nation or homeland as by force of circumstances. And right now, in the midst of a pandemic, we have one example of a type of exile, people who are having to flee dire circumstances due to the pandemic, going to other countries where they can find a safe haven. But we also think about war as another circumstance that may force people to flee their homelands to seek asylum elsewhere. Here we have a map that shows us global diasporic movements, and you can see these arrows are going all over the place. I just want to refer to a couple of these diasporic movements that we will be referring to in more detail during today's session. You can see here on the map, we've got a lot of arrows coming into North America, the New World as it was called in the 15th century upon Columbus's arrival. You see arrows coming in from all around, but you also see arrows coming to the New World from Western Europe, from the UK, from Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula. They're going through Africa, Western Africa, where the transatlantic slave trade would pick up captives and then take them across the Middle Passage to North America. You also have south to north migration within the Western Hemisphere from South America, the Caribbean, Central America, into North America. You also have a Russian diaspora, a Russian Jewish diaspora that travels between Western Europe and also the Middle East into Israel and then to North America. And then the other one that I'll focus on now is the Indian subcontinent. And so here we have South Asian diaspora migration, either back to the colonial center in London and the United Kingdom or other parts of Western Europe, then to the Americas, or sometimes to Australia or to other parts of Asia, and then the United States. And so we'll talk more about these different diasporic movements throughout today's session. But to just define the term diaspora, we will think about it as the movement, migration, or scattering of people away from an established or ancestral homeland, or the people themselves who settled far away from their ancestral homelands and refer to themselves as a diasporic community, for example, and then the place where these people live. So you may have the people of a diasporic community settled into an urban community or some other city like Houston or Dallas or San Francisco, for example. And we are going to explain some of these key terms as they relate to the diaspora, and also why an understanding of diaspora communities is very important, especially in this day and age. And then finally, we're going to identify ways that organizations like SACAM, the host of this conscious curriculum series, and then other genealogical sites that help you do family history and heritage tracing, like Ancestry.com, 23andMe, or FamilySearch.com. These are all contributing to a better understanding of diaspora by helping us understand our connectedness through our genes to people in faraway places. With that, I'll just go ahead and wrap up the introduction and then turn it back over to Avery and Abi to continue our discussion. And we'll come back and do a couple more polls during this discussion. Thank you both.
Thank you, Dr. Gentry. So to start our line of questioning for you, Dr. Gentry, our first question is, can the people of a diaspora feel a separation from their country of origin? And if so, how does that necessarily affect things like movement building for the diasporic group?
Good question. And I'll go ahead and then just repeat part of the question just to make sure that everyone's clear, and so that I can get my answer also directly to your question. So you say that is there a way in which people can feel disconnected from their community within the diaspora? Am I understanding the question correctly?
Right, and this birthplace or homeland.
Right, and so we have a couple of different ways that we might think about people feeling a separation from homeland or from an ancestral population. We might talk about a victim diaspora community, and so when we talk about the African slave trade, that's one way in which people were involuntarily taken away from their homeland, and then also made to not really be able to carry on their cultural practices in ways that they might want to, that was an intentional way to break their sense of connectedness and community. And so when you think about slavery in the Americas, it was based on skin color eventually, and it was because a lot of the Native Americans who were attempted to be enslaved in the earliest days knew the land well, and they spoke each other's languages, and they were able to, resist enslavement in some ways, but they were also liable to catch diseases that they were not immune to, and so they died off more easily. The enslavers found that African peoples from different parts of that continent, once they're put together, they can't really communicate because they speak different languages. And in that way, they might lose some of their cultural practices. Now, we know that wasn't all lost. There was a lot of retention of music, of foodways, of other cultural practices, whether it's language or dance or other ways of expressing oneself that keep that were retained over the decades and centuries, and people were able to form a new sense of themselves and communities as African Americans. Another example of a victim diaspora would be the Jewish community. But again, we have examples of a strong connectedness and carrying forth of traditions. And so there's ways in which there are choices that have to be made to cultivate and to retain those cultural heritage, traditions, and practices. And it can be easy to be separated from them. But once people start to ask questions about themselves, where am I from? Who are my people? Where do I belong? Then they may come to rediscover these types of diasporic traditions and may even rediscover their own identity in a way that they may not have known before. So that separation may not be a permanent sense of alienation or exile, but there are ways that people can reconnect with their communities through cultural practices.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gentry. And now for our second question, what societal causes, especially in America, are shown to separate a diaspora from their heritage or homeland as a way to take away from the group's power? This can be for Dr. Gentry.
So again, we're getting into some of the American roots of diasporic tension. I'll put it that way. It's a term that I like to use when I speak about diaspora, because there are these push and pull factors, both in terms of the reasons why people migrate in the first place. They may be pushed out of a place because of violence, for example, or there could be famine, crop failures, drought, other difficult natural disasters may push people away from a certain location. And then you also have pull factors. There may be economic opportunities that might pull people to some new location, job opportunities, educational opportunities, family members already living in other places and finding better opportunities. So when we think about the American situation, we think about the transatlantic slavery as one of the oldest and most pervasive causes to separate African peoples from their homeland. But then we can also think about ways in which Jewish people or Latinx people have also been discriminated against and segregated within the United States. And then we can say that about other ethnic groups who are more recent arrivals to this nation. So when we think about people of Hispanic heritage, they were here, in places in the Southwest like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Colorado, and Utah. And they were in a country that was once Spain, and then it became Mexico. And when we think about Six Flags Over Texas, those were a couple of those flags. But then when the Texas Revolution happens, it's not that those people migrated anywhere. The border crossed them. And so they became migrants, a diasporic community in a place that was once their own land. And so you have factors like war and expansion of the American territory that causes a group to have to make decisions. And so some people went deeper into the Mexican interior. Some decided to stick it out and stay here. And that's where the Latinx, especially Mexican-American population, began to grow in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. And they would experience some of the same discriminations like segregation that African-Americans experience, but on a different level. So for many Latinx communities, they were often segregated by language as well as skin color. But the school segregation was based on the English not being the first language spoken at home. And so you have these kinds of tensions where people are forced to assimilate, to adopt the practices of the dominant group and to give up their older practices. And so you have a lot of people with Spanish-speaking Latinx roots here in Texas and all throughout parts of the Southwest, where there is a divide or a split between those who speak the language, Spanish, in the older generations, and then some of the younger generations who are not necessarily native speakers. And so that's a way in which they can feel like there's a tension or a separation between these different generations within a diaspora. But it's always something that they can go back to. The foodways, again, are things that survive and celebrate and are passed on. And language is the same way. It can be relearned. It can be practiced more widely. And now we're seeing bilingualism and biculturalism being something that's valued now. And so there's a north-south sense of diaspora in the Latinx community that's overcoming some of those past discriminations and negative experiences.
Thank you, Dr. Gentry. And for Dr. Punjabi, in context to certain groups of people who don't necessarily belong to X or Y diasporas, how does this idea or concept of diaspora affect the feeling of belonging or discrimination in people who are part of these types of groups?
So I really believe that the subject of diaspora more and more has become an identity, a search for identity. I think especially during what's happening in our world right now, individuals are looking for who am I? So it's so important to first look at home. The holidays is a great way to find out your heritage. I know we talked a little bit about looking at genealogy, but whether you identify or feel disconnected with your culture or with your minority group or with your diaspora is really a matter of getting involved and getting into that organization or getting into that diaspora and asking questions and finding the similarities between yourself and that diaspora group, or finding the similarities within the diasporas it's just interesting in India. I kind of looked this up and it was mind blowing to me. There's 19,500 mother tongues. And then there's 122 Indian official tongues, 122 national Indian official languages. So you can feel separated or you can feel the connection. I really think, and my mom told me when she was in elementary school and middle school in India, she had to learn 6 languages. And I think that's kind of cool because within the Indian diaspora, you had to learn 6 languages. So I think it should be mandatory that we should learn about our diasporas within our diasporas and feel that connection. But I think it's a little bit of a journey, and I think it's a little bit of self-exploration and then learning about your diaspora and your culture.
Thank you, Dr. Punjabi. And this is for Dr. Punjabi and Dr. Gentry. So what is the difference between victim and labor diasporas? How do both have a harmful history in the way of reasons for migration?
Dr. Gentry, if you want to take that one first.
Yes, and I began discussing this on the victim side of things, and so I'll talk a little bit more about labor diaspora. And if we think about some of the more recent trends in diasporic migration patterns, we see the example of the South Asian diaspora being one of the newer diaspora that's really changing the way that we look at the patterns of and movements of people. And so the South Asian diaspora is very complex, as Dr. Punjabi just mentioned, culturally, linguistically, religiously, and politically. And so, they have multiple identities, and there's a lot of intersections across different groups, and it's constantly changing, constantly shifting. And so there seems to be less of a need to necessarily assimilate into the dominant culture when a lot of these newer groups arrive. What they're coming for is that they've got a very specific skill set that's valued in the American economy and in the job market. Or they could be coming for education to develop the skills that they can either use to make a living and earn money that they can send back to the homeland, or they may travel back to the homeland themselves. There's a lot of people who do move back and forth between their homeland and their adopted land. And if they do go back to the homeland, then they can take their skills back and help develop and rebuild the land. Just to give a couple of examples, we've got Kamala Harris, who's the vice presidential, vice president-elect coming into office, who is a child of immigrants, both Jamaican and South Asian Indian migrants. They met in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So they joined, through political causes and political beliefs. And now they have a child who is going on to become the first female vice presidential vice president in the United States. Barack Obama is another example. His father came from Kenya to study in the United States in the late 1950s as a group of what they called the African airlift to America. And those students went to study at places like Howard University in DC, or Michigan State University in Lansing, or the University of Hawaii, which is where Barack Obama Sr. Landed and met the woman who would become his wife, and they would have a child named Barack Obama, who would become the first African-American president of the United States. But Barack Obama Sr. did not stay in the United States. He went back to Kenya. He took the education and the skills that he developed and went back to his homeland. And so there are constant flux, constant shifting. And so there's education, there's labor. These are the newer push and pull factors that are bringing diasporic communities to lands far and wide away from their homelands.
I wanted to mention there's some phenomenal TED Talks right now If you just Google Diaspora and some great talks, Kingsley Adkins was one, and then I saw another really great talk about the Great Diaspora Divide. But to answer the question, I think the difference between a victim and labor diaspora, there are some people that are part of a diaspora by no choice of their own. And I think Dr. Gentry talked about territories that have been emancipated. And there's also indentured servants. There was people, they didn't have a choice. And then there's labor diasporas that have a choice and kind of don't have a choice. I know that an indentured servant, for example, is a type of labor diaspora that you don't have a choice. But there's a choice now in labor diasporas. And I was just looking this up. I still don't understand it, but I think the term is really cool. It's called a coolieist. And a coolie is a subcaste in the Indian culture. And they're being identified as the coolest, like really cool and hip. And that's kind of bringing Gandhi together and his very calm culture with giving voice to a group that would be a labor diaspora, and they're called coolies. And it's spelled, I believe it's spelled Coolie. And if you go to India and you look for a coolie, he's the guy, or well, I think they're mostly men. I just realized that. But they come and help you, and they come and help you get things out of the taxis. And you can tell, obviously, I'm kind of a privileged Indian because I go there, and this is another diaspora. I'm an Americanized Indian, and I was treated so differently, causes a separation within a diaspora. Maybe we can talk about that too later.
Right, and directly bouncing off of that, Dr. Punjabi, as like a second generation immigrant, or as someone from a different type of community, a different type of diaspora, how can other people there are oftentimes a separation of confusion. So how can other people in that diaspora encourage the acceptance of everyone, or rather everyone who identifies?
I want to talk about something that's kind of new and being introduced with networking within your diaspora. And that breaks bonds, because what it does is allows for the human connection of resources, which can lend so much power to a diaspora. But one way to connect with your diaspora is to find the outliers or different diasporas. Like I said, there's so many languages in the in India, but could we connect with someone that has a different language and find the commonality between us? And the last part of your question, Abhi, can you just say that last part, please?
Right. How can people within the diaspora make it more welcoming or easier for other people to assimilate?
Yeah, and I think a great way to do that, to allow other people to assimilate, is to find the strengths within the diaspora, find the success stories, learn about the different diasporas within your diaspora, and find what connects us rather than what divides us.
Thank you, Dr. Punjabi. Our next question is, people may hear the phrases, "you aren't really Mexican, Black, Asian," because it doesn't fit in their standard. Why is there a standard for some diasporas?
Did you want me to answer that, Avery?
Yes, please.
Okay. So it's very human to try and put someone in a box. It's almost what the brain does. The brain gets sensory information. Someone looks different, has an accent, and the tendency is to put them inside of a box. And the key to this is don't form those barriers. It's really important that we look for not just the commonalities, but for ways for people to connect. and there is a tendency for us to look for our diaspora. I think a diaspora is now even becoming not just related to our country of origin, but maybe even a group, a cultural group, or like a favorite, or you could have a diaspora that are Weight Watchers individuals, and they're a group of people that are on the Weight Watchers program. And I mean, I think it's important to identify the commonalities to find out who you are in that diaspora, but then also to take that forward and to relate to how you're connected, that diaspora is connected to other people. Did I answer that, Avery? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And for Dr. Gentry, we talked about at the beginning of this how media and media initiatives are influencing society. So what are some ways that these types of initiatives can connect people to their heritage? And how can we try and like move these into schools or community activities?
We're doing it tonight, that's for sure. So thank you for taking the initiative in that. And we're using, new media technologies, this video conferencing call to invite people in from, far and wide to to participate in this conversation and be a part of it. I did want to also just point out that it's organizations like SACAM and other cultural heritage entities that are allowing people to discover more about themselves, to help them learn how to preserve their own history, their own culture. And we're seeing this across different groups, and it's not something that's just exclusive to these groups. It's something that can be opened up to different people to explore these questions of identity, to learn something about someone that they know or someone that they don't know that they want to learn more about. I'm going to share my screen one more time just to go through some examples of this. On the website, hopefully some folks had a chance to look at the resources and activities that we shared in the conscious curriculum on the SACAM website. We shared an article that's about finding Afro-Mexico, and this is a book that's written by Professor Ted Cohen at Lindenwood University in Missouri. And his book is called Finding Afro-Mexico, Race and Nation After the Revolution. And he's looking at this oftentimes overlooked presence of people of African descent in Mexico. And so this kind of gets to some of your questions about, why is it that sometimes we feel that people fit in or don't fit in? Well, this isn't a new phenomenon. This is something that goes back to the abolition of slavery in Mexico and Black people finding the Underground Railroad south. It didn't just go north to Canada. Black people also went south to Mexico for freedom after Mexico abolished slavery in the late 1820s. And this was, a phenomenon that is really just being studied more deeply. The Black men who would go down and work in the silver and gold mines would then make their way back to the United States and start their lives anew. In the 1940s, you have the example of Catherine Dunham, who was actually studying the African origins of cultures in Mexico. And so she actually went down to Mexico in 1946. This photo of her wearing this sombrero was actually taken by Carl Van Vechten, the socialite of New York, and who took many pictures of different lights of the Harlem Renaissance. He took this photo of her in this Mexican garb as she's sort of exploring these different questions of cultural identity. Well, she was mostly interested in how to perform La Bamba, the song that we now know from the Richie Valens rock version of it. But she had an Afro-diasporic dance troupe. They blended African-American and Mexican history, cultures, and dances. And she found where Black people went south to Mexico or Brazil, or we also have diaspora communities that went to Europe, either during and after World War I or World War II, and settled in Paris or London and places like that. Paul Robeson is one example of that. You have Josephine Baker, as another example of that. They became Pan-Africanists because of their exposure to the likes of students from African countries. These resources on the SACAM website, we've translated them, and so they're available bilingual in bilingual format. So for those of you who want to read in Spanish or English, this is one way to expand the way in which you look at other cultures, other languages, and to actually engage and participate in what may seem to be something that's different or unusual for you. But we also have some examples of other cultural heritage organizations. And so in addition to SACAM here in San Antonio, the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum, which is documenting and storing and sharing Black history in San Antonio, you also have the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio, which is doing something similar with Jewish heritage and history. There's also the South Asian diaspora that's represented with the digital archive called SADA, and they are doing something very similar to what SACAM is doing here in San Antonio, up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So here you see the Sutton family that settled in San Antonio in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he went through Mexico. He worked down in mines in Mexico after being run out of Virginia, but then he found his way to San Antonio, where Samuel J. Sutton and his wife Lillian Sutton became educators in the local community. They spoke Spanish and English, and they taught in local schools on the East Side, and we are celebrating their heritage. But with the Jewish tradition, we have the Holocaust Memorial and Museum that has developed curriculum for World War II studies in high schools. They started that in 1975, and they're still doing it to this day, and they give young people chances to hear the stories of survivors of the Holocaust. And it's important for them to hear those stories and to share those memories and those traditions. And in the South Asian American Digital Archive in Philadelphia, they've got a project that they call the Road Trips Project, where they're asking South Asian Americans to hit the road, travel across America, and share their photos so that they can add their own stories to this tradition of the American road trip. And so these are different ways in which you and your family and your friends can actually help to cultivate, to celebrate, and to preserve cultural practices and traditions within your own communities, or to learn more about others as well. And so I just wanted to make sure that everyone's aware of those opportunities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gentry. Our next question is, why do people outside of diasporas feel threatened by the idea of a strong, united heritage? And this can be for Dr. Gentry and Dr. Punjabi.
I think that it's very common for human beings, for actually any creature on the planet, to feel threatened by something that seems bigger than itself. And so when we break down the differences and kind of look at how we're common, we won't be so threatened. I think a diaspora is trying to assimilate into its new culture. And if we can keep that in mind, we'll remember that they're human beings trying to fit in. It's very common within the diaspora to have sort of an identity struggle. Am I part of the diaspora, or am I part of the bigger culture? And I think embracing the struggle that an individual may be going through. Am I unique and of myself, or am I part of this group? And is that group part of the other group? I think those are all things that we need to embrace and allow people to go through.
And the next poll has appeared on your screen. It's not a test. It's just something that we're asking you to guess to see if people are aware. If you visited the website, the SACAM website, and saw the conscious curriculum, then you probably already know the answer because we shared an article. But just go ahead and take a guess anyway, and we want to see if people are familiar with the largest diaspora. in the world. We've talked about it some already in this session, so we'll see the results of the poll in just a moment. Just to speak briefly to this idea of fear, this is, it goes both ways. So there's a sense of fear of someone who's different or other, who may have had to flee some situation in their homeland and arrive in someplace new where they're a stranger, and they're perceived as the cause of problems in the communities in which they arrive. And you saw this with many Jewish people in Europe in the early part of the 20th century, as they had to leave Eastern Europe into Western Europe to places like Germany. And they were constantly seeking a homeland, which would eventually, result in their arrival in places like Israel. In the United States, the forced migration of African Americans into this country, and then their eventual emancipation, led to some easiness in the shift in power relations and the different power dynamics, so that Blacks were perceived as a threat and then became targets of hatred and terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. And so there's a way in which there's a sense of blaming others, of scapegoating. And then there's also this sense of resentment. If people feel that other groups are getting together and getting ahead somehow, then you get a lot of conspiracy theories or some types of myths or rumors that spread about other groups. And this can be very dangerous. It can lead to these sort of popular uprisings against other groups. And so we have to be aware of this happening from time to time. There may be no real foundation to it other than a fear of losing something or resentment about others. And no place is immune to this. It's something that happens everywhere around the world at some time, and we see these little tensions or big tensions. I don't want to downplay it. They can arise just about anywhere, and so we kind of have to keep our vigilance and stay aware of the ways in which we are recognizing and welcoming others into our communities, and basically remembering the golden rule, treating others like we would want to be treated ourselves. If we were strangers in a strange land, we would hope that someone would understand our plight and try to help us get back on our feet.
Thank you, Doctor. Go ahead.
I think the Holocaust is one of the worst examples of a diaspora scapegoating against another diaspora. And I think the key to not having something like that happen again is to identify with your diaspora, find identity, and that's healthy. And then remember not to judge another diaspora, another organization of people that is different from your own.
Yeah, you'll hear the phrase "never forget" when we talk about the Holocaust, and that's what cultural heritage is really about. Let's remember our roots, where we come from, who we really are, and that way we can use the truth, use history, use our cherished cultural practices, which in many times, if we think about the celebration of lights around this time of year, the darkest time of the year, it's the solstice. Hanukkah just happened. Where there's lighting of candles to kind of bring light to the darkness. The same thing happens with Diwali, the festival of lights from the South Asian populations. And then we also have Kwanzaa, which is a more recently invented tradition, but it is an attempt to help Black people who feel oppressed and politically marginalized in the United States to feel a sense of unity and togetherness, and to celebrate certain principles by lighting candles in the days following Christmas. But it isn't something that's intended to be a threat or to deny anyone else their culture or their heritage. It's to say we have something to celebrate ourselves. We just had to rediscover it, to find it and say, oh, let's value these traditional African principles and celebrate them in a day that or a celebration that we'll call Kwanzaa. And I was happy to see that some people answered the poll to say that they celebrated Kwanzaa. Happy Kwanzaa, y'all. And here are the results of the poll. Most people got it right, that India is the largest diaspora population.
And I think that Dr. Gentry, that's been fairly recent if we look at history. Before, we heard great things about Syrians and the Russians, and now it is Indians more recently. So it's just amazing how it can change. But, the greatest thing about a diaspora really is that individuals within a diaspora can feel the loyalty to their country, to their country of origin, and come back or give back, which is also a huge thing that's happening within diasporas for diasporas.
If we could now have a topic conclusion from Dr. Punjabi, that would be great.
I think Dr. Gentry talked about bilingualism and multiculturalism is really becoming embraced. And I think that that's a great sign. I think a diaspora is very important. What diaspora do you belong to? Find out. And then remember that we're all ultimately similar, and what brings us together, especially if you're identifying with a diaspora. Learn about your own diaspora, what brings them together, and then learn about the bigger diaspora, which is the human race.
That's wonderful. Again, this is Heather Williams with SACAM, and on behalf of SACAM, I want to just touch on the topic the fact that I learned so much in tonight's discussion. Thank you so very much. I think my takeaway from this discussion tonight is the importance of that ceremony of illumination that we discussed earlier. Again, the Kwanzaa lighting of the Kinara, the Jewish celebration, Diwali, all of those shed light on the importance of everyone coming together, whether it's within a diaspora or outside of the diaspora. And no matter where we go, we can always find a thread of commonality, whether that's over food, cultural celebrations, music. The importance of us coming together and sharing our unique qualities is so very important for our survival. So again, I thank you for that insight, everyone.